Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Hello, and welcome to episode 82 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. As the house lights fade into darkness, we hear the sounds of an audience settling in a theater. And then, when the lights snap up, a play is in progress on the stage. It is the last act of Chekhov's The Seagull, and Constantine is pleading with Nina, the love of his life, not to leave him again. However, Nina fails to respond on cue to his pleas, much to the actor playing Constantine's distress. In fact, it is soon evident that the actress playing Nina is not properly in command of her surroundings. Her speech is slurred, and she begins to speak random lines that are not in Chekhov's text. She moves as if in a trance, pulling Nina's wig off her head. A stage manager rushes on to save her from falling off the front of the stage, and the scene dissolves into a cacophony of noise and flashing light, as if the actress had found herself in a nightclub. The scene changes again, and she is in the reception of a drug and alcohol rehabilitation center, holding her phone and trying to light a cigarette. She is very intoxicated. This is the unsettling opening of Duncan Macmillan's blistering portrait of addiction and invented identity, people, places, and things. The play premiered at the National Theatre in 2015 before transferring to the West End the following year and then on to New York a year later. Denise Gough won awards for her electrifying performance as the disturbed actress, Emma. And as we record this episode, she is reprising her role nearly a decade on at the Trafalgar Theatre in London's West End. It is an unforgettable, virtuoso performance, fierce, funny, poignant, and technically completely commanding. The revival was directed by Jeremy Herrin, who also directed the original production, and it is a popular and critical triumph. I believe that its author was surprised by the play's initial commercial success, saying, "It's about a difficult person being difficult to other people who are in a difficult situation." It is certainly an unflinching portrait of the real struggle and pain of battling addiction, as well as an exploration of how we seek to define our identity to ourselves and to anyone else. It's a fascinating and challenging play and an exhilarating piece of theater. I'm therefore especially delighted to be able to talk today with both the author, Duncan Macmillan, and the play's director, Jeremy Herrin. Regular listeners will know that Jeremy was very recently my guest on the podcast when we talked about Eugene O'Neill's majestic play, Long Day's Journey into Night, his wonderful production of which, starring Brian Cox and Patricia Clarkson, is finishing its run in London's West End as we speak. For those who haven't heard that episode yet, Jeremy has been a director of Live Theatre Newcastle, the Royal Court, and Headlong Theatre Companies. Highlights of his distinguished career include directing Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall and Bring Up the Bodies for the RSC, as well as several of James Graham's plays on London stages. Thanks very much for coming back for another in-depth discussion about plays, Jeremy. Much appreciated.
You're welcome. Nice to be here.
Duncan Macmillan's plays include Lungs from 2011, which was revived in 2019 in a stellar production at the Old Vic with Claire Foy and Matt Smith, and which was then live-streamed from the empty auditorium when we were starved of theatre in the early days of COVID in June 2020, and which we covered then in episode 7 of the podcast. Duncan's other plays include his adaptation of 1984, co-written with Robert Icke, and Every Brilliant Thing, which was a breakout hit at the Edinburgh Festival in 2014 and has since been performed by comic and actor Johnny Donahue all over the world. 10 years on, he returns to Edinburgh with the show this summer. Most recently, Duncan wrote the English text for Thomas Ostermeyer's striking adaptation of Ibsen's An Enemy of the People, which played in London's West End, again with Matt Smith, and again, which we covered in episode 77 of the podcast. So as you see, Duncan, we've talked about some of your work on the podcast, so it's a great pleasure to meet you. Thank you for coming.
Happy to be here.
So I'd like to start, Duncan, with that inevitable question. Where did the story of Emma and her struggle come from, and why did you want to write about addiction?
I think it came from a number of different places. The main thing really, I think, was the experience of addiction isn't always well represented in drama. And I think partly that's a structural problem. And as a writer, I wanted to sort of solve that structural problem somehow from the impulse of wanting to write authentically about what that experience is like. And I think one of the structural problems with it is theatre needs a definitive endpoint. A play needs that final definitive moment where we can all clap and go home. And in representations of addiction, that is often either being fixed forever and it's no longer an issue, or death. They're the two options usually in stories of addiction. And that's not the true experience of so many people who are living in recovery and people who are still living in addiction. And as I say, I wanted to write something primarily that would make people who knew that lived experience, who had that lived experience, who either are in recovery themselves or know or love someone with an addiction. I wanted those people to feel accurately represented on stage. I wanted them to feel seen. And in order to do so, I wanted to try and solve that structural issue so it didn't feel frustratingly open-ended. That was a slightly waffled answer, but that's where it came from, the initial impulse, I think.
Now, it's striking, Jeremy, isn't it, actually having just done Long Day's Journey into Night, talking about not having an ending, so to speak, a final ending, that we leave Mary there, don't we, at the end, with it just going on.
Yeah. Yeah, we've all just had enough by then. So, we clap and we go. I think, one of the really wonderful things about People, Places and Things, and I was reminded of it again, having worked on it, is that Duncan very cleverly gets his cake and eats it in that he gives us like several endings. So we have the emotional sort of landing of what happens to Emma in group, that she makes a breakthrough to admit that she's got a problem and she starts the long journey of working on it. And then we have that moment where she goes home to her parents and we realize that it's a daily struggle and that story never ends, that you have to work on it every day. So we kind of get the reality of the experience, but there is the hint of closure and the feeling of closure. I think it makes it a more satisfying evening in some ways than something that would realistically just reboot every morning and you start your journey of recovery again.
I think one of the other challenges must be, Duncan, isn't it, that some of this is not easy to watch, to make audiences sit through. So did that exercise you when thinking about writing about addiction?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the journey we go on with the play is that we might not particularly like this person to begin with, but hopefully by the end of it, she has our sympathies. We care about whether she's going to be all right or not. And also part of the attraction to writing about this was I wanted to write a really big barnstorming role in which someone got to do everything, that they got to scream and shout and cry and laugh and fall apart and come back together again and do everything all in one performance. And the process of going through drug and alcohol rehabilitation is, can be life at quite a far extreme, and a sort of reckoning with your past and thinking about yourself in the present and a planning for the future. It felt like it magnified so much of what human existence is, and felt like it would be good fodder for a lot of acting and some good moments in the theatre.
Well, it's certainly a lot of acting. You're right. It's a barnstorming role. And I guess you're right, the process. I mean, I suppose in some ways it breaks us down. It opens us up completely, and then you have to rebuild. So there's a lot on display, I think, in that sense. I read that it took you 8 years to write the play. Is that right? And if so, why was it such a long process?
It did. Yeah, I mean, plays take me quite a long time to write.
That's allowed, by the way.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Lungs came very quickly. Every Brilliant Thing, the gestation period from its original short story to when it was first performed in Edinburgh was again quite a number of years. This one, partly I felt a huge responsibility to get it right for the reasons I've already described. And to do so took a lot of work and research. I realized quite early on that if I'm able to finish this play and if I'm lucky enough to get it performed, there will be people every night for whom these issues are of sort of mortal significance directly to their lives. And even if it only were to play to 10 people a night, there'll be people in that audience who it speaks to directly. And I understood that if I got that wrong, if I was careless or exploitative, or if I didn't take that seriously, it could be quite damaging for those people. And so it felt like a huge responsibility that if I was going to follow this through, I had to get it really right. And I think a lot of that time that it took to get it right was handing drafts to people who could tell me what I was getting wrong and what I needed to include. And a lot of it was going into rehabilitation centers and spending time there and talking to therapists and doctors and people in recovery, people who'd lost people. And then I had the experience of people would volunteer their own life stories. If that experience was part of their lives, they would often hold my feet to the fire and say, make sure you don't do this. If you're going to write about addiction, people always do this. That's an unhelpful stereotype. That's a trope. That's not true. People with that lived experience really wanted to make sure I was going to get it right. The example I often think about is I had a hairdresser who was making small talk and asked what I did. And I was saying I was writing a play, and he said, "What's your play called?" And I said the title of the play. And to many people, it's the vaguest title you could give to a play. Every play on earth could be called People, Places and Things. But to a very specific group of people, it means a very specific thing. And in the case of this guy who was cutting my hair, he rolled up his shirt sleeve and he showed me that he had the Serenity Prayer tattooed on his arm. And he so generously told me about his life and was one of these people who said, please don't do this. Please do this instead. They always get this wrong, but this is what it's really like. You've got to say this. And really was asking me this question, why are you writing it? Why do you want to write this? What are you getting out of this? And it was people like this who really held me to account. If I'm going to write about this, I've got to make sure that I'm bringing these people along with me. And I sort of feel like it's a very strange feeling now looking at my name underneath it and being interviewed on podcasts like this to talk about it, where I'm very proud of the work I did on it. But a large part of the work I did on it was involving other people and listening to other people. And theatre is collaborative so much in its nature anyway. But the number of people's work and life, it belongs to so many other people. I think partly that's what makes it hopefully resonate with people who know this experience. It's been water tested over and over and over to see where the holes are. That was a very long answer, but that's why it took nearly a decade to write.
That's a great answer. Fabulous approach, of course, because if you know something, it's true, isn't it? If you know something about a specific subject, whether it's in journalism or drama or whatever, if you get it wrong, you're lost. I mean, I don't have the kind of experiences that you're describing, but it feels authentic to me, certainly. And you have testimonies that it does. And it's fascinating that actually in the course of the play course, in the addiction center and in the group therapies, we hear some sobering collection of personal stories. I don't know whether these are actually verbatim, but they all ring true. And the variety of people who've done terrible things to themselves and other people under the influence. And it doesn't shirk either from those realities or the difficulties of the treatment. So yes, I think it was worth the time.
Good.
Jeremy, I was going to ask you, nearly 10 years on from when you first directed it, why did you want to return to the play? Have you thought about it differently this time? And if so, in what way?
I haven't thought about it that differently. And it feels tempting to think of it as, putting a production aside and then coming back to it willfully. And the truth is that it never really went away. We've always had an ambition to do it, not really to kind of scoop up success, but really to share the material. It became pretty evident early on that the definition of success for this show was much more about how it impacted people that needed it, and particularly how it talked to people in that sober community, that recovery community, that it always felt like a really rewarding transaction to share it. So we've always just wanted as many people to see it and enjoy it as possible. And there's always been talk about doing it again, and it's just taken this long. So it doesn't feel like, hey, now's the time to revive it. It's been something that we've been trying to do since we last did it in New York.
Do you think that the world's different from when it first appeared and our response is different? And did you change it in any way?
Changed it a little bit. Duncan incorporated a tiny reference to COVID and pandemic and so on. And the world has changed. I mean, the bump around 2019, 2020, 21 was huge. And particularly as pertains to the language and a vocabulary around mental health. And so it was interesting going back to the play in detail, and without overly flattering Duncan, that doesn't need any more praise, surely. He got so much exactly right before the language caught up So it was really, really reassuring to realize that actually in 2014 that he was ahead of the game in terms of talking about addiction, particularly in the way that it is an expression of trauma, often childhood trauma and failing parental caregiving relationships. So we didn't have to change anything fundamental.
Duncan, do you think there's some difference to the way it's being received?
That's interesting. I think the reviews that I've read have been more inclined to, I don't know if this is true or not, but someone was saying this and I think they might have a point. The first time it was reviewed, it felt much more that they were describing a play which was about an actress going through drug and alcohol rehabilitation and not the bigger themes. And now people are much more likely to be talking about trauma. They're talking about identity. They're talking about how to create meaning in such a divided, chaotic world, how to find truth in a post-truth universe. All of those things, the bigger underlying themes of it were, I think, overlooked more 10 years ago in probably a slightly misogynist context where female characters didn't often get to be those sort of spokespeople for the bigger, wider issues. They had to have much more specific personal experiences. That's all it could be about. Whereas now I think that the discourse has shifted, thankfully, around that.
Yes, and as Jeremy is saying, I guess the discourse is just more open
Yeah.
to discussion of mental health challenges and dependencies and trauma, as you say, and there's more of an acceptance and tolerance. It's more universal, frankly, I think, ultimately. For those who have not yet seen the show and may not get to, because we also have international listeners, I wonder if we might just give them a very brief outline of the plot. I realize we may give some spoilers away, but I hasten to say that that should in no way stop you from going to see this production if you haven't already, or you can just choose not to listen until after you've been. But Duncan, could you just give us the briefest outline about what goes on in the story of this actress, Emma?
Sure, I'll try. After she falls apart in mid-performance of The Seagull, as you described, Chekhov's play, she checks herself into a rehabilitation center, essentially because she doesn't really feel like she's got a problem at this stage. She just has obviously been told, you are a risk. We are not going to keep you in this play. She's seen by the theatre community as someone who needs to sort herself out. And so she wants to have done the time, done the process, so she can get a certificate which says, I've completed the program, I'm fine. That's all she really wants at that point. She's not taking it that seriously. And the first act, I suppose, shows her struggling to engage with the process. She's conflicted. She wants to get through it, but she also finds it very frightening and exposing, and it makes her very vulnerable, and she wants to control it. And the first act ends with her leaving treatment before she's completed her minimum time. And the second act begins with her checking herself back in again. Some time has passed. And the second act essentially, structurally, is a repeat of the first act, but she appears to have a very different attitude towards it. And this time she's really engaging with everything. It's no longer about the certificate for work. It's now about saving her life and getting well. And the same steps play out that we've already seen. When I'm structuring a play, I think it's like telling a good joke. It's also set up and payoff. And for something to land with an audience, you need to just make sure you've really clearly set it up. But there's also a degree of misdirection, so they're not seeing it coming a mile off. And to go back to what I was saying at the beginning about the sort of structural problem with depicting addiction, the two possibilities that she'll either die or she'll be definitively fixed are posited throughout as the two possible endings we're headed for. And so the second act is sort of honing in on which of those two outcomes it's going to be. And then, without giving too much away, I suppose we've described the ending a little bit. A friend of mine said it's like you have the two sides of a coin. You have one ending on one side that she's going to die, and on the other side of the coin it says she's going to be fixed definitively. And then the whole play is sort of flicking this coin in the air. And the trick of the ending is sort of landing it on its edge and articulating the question rather than definitively answering it for people, because that's more true of the lived experience.
Yes. So as you said earlier, there's no clear ending like that, which we'll come to talk about the ending at the end. And also you were saying about setup and payoff. There's some fascinating ways which you play with that too. And the payoff isn't necessarily what you expect. She is in denial when she first arrives, isn't she? She thinks all she needs is a tune-up. But when she lists the medication and the drink that she's on and that she's had blackouts and she says, I think I tried to kill myself, it's clear she's underestimating the seriousness of her problem. But she also has issues with the process. She's an extremely rational character who's capable of challenging that. So we'll talk a bit about how that plays out as well. I wanted to ask you, Jeremy, about the perspective on the play, because Emma is so clearly the central protagonist of the play. As you said, this huge role, and it's all about her. But more than that, it feels like the play is presented largely from her point of view, as if we're experiencing the world as she does, in some way representing her interior experience. Is that right?
Yes, correct. Well done.
Okay, that wasn't an open question.
No, I mean, that is right. And it's a fun way of enjoying, what in real life would be hideously uncomfortable experiences. But theatrically, you can enjoy her perspective. And, the question of likability often floats around narratives and fictions like this in quite an irritating way, I think. I just think it's quite a redundant classification to judge a character on whether they're likable or not. I think the journey of successful art is to understand yourself, I suppose, ultimately, but in doing so through engaging with characters, and the more tricky, the better. And Emma is a tricky character. She's a complex character. There's no point in stepping into a rehearsal room unless you're pursuing that. And so to understand her, it's good to see things from her point of view. And it's a neat trick of Duncan's writing that her experience, that there's a sort of edit, there's a limitation on what we show, which is showing significant moments in her experience on that journey. And for certain moments when we get to rehab and she engages with the group, it's a very useful device to contain the story so that you meet the other members of the group and you select those moments in so far as their stories affect her narrative momentum. So it's a really great device.
I mean, it might even just be her attention span. We get as much of them as she's interested in listening to. I don't think it's quite that. But I was going to ask you about technically how you represent the fact that it's her perspective, because it's quite disorienting at times. In particular, for example, the transition between scenes, like I said at the beginning.
Sure.
And stage direction, having reread the text. I was intrigued by the challenge you must have had, Jeremy, at times for saying, oh, okay, how do we deliver this? Which is trying to represent the disorientation, the chaos, the discombobulation that she is experiencing.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I mean, I hate it when I'm working with another writer on an adaptation at the moment, and he just sent me an email saying, it's going really well. I'm really sorry, though. It's going to be really hard to stage. That just lit me up. It just made me delighted. I was like, make it as hard as you like, please. Because, that's the dream, is that writers write what they can only just imagine. And then it's my job to go, hey, how about this? Or do you think this is a different version of that? Or this is possible? And we're really lucky, it's maybe a good moment to, I know we're not talking strictly about the play, we're talking about the production now, but Bunny Christie, the designer, has just done such a brilliant job of bringing it together, and particularly some great video work from Andrzej Goulding. We can see what Emma is seeing with the tiles on the walls, and the other characters can't see that. And that's just a way of just placing us in her mind. And it helps me in that scene to work with Denise and just that she can be as bratty as she likes in that scene, because ultimately the audience is going to see the world through her eyes, and there's going to be a nice tension between those two positions. I suppose the thing the production often gets mentioned is the detoxing, is how we get to witness many different versions of Emma going through a very extreme withdrawal that makes what would be a really harrowing experience in real life hopefully energizing in the theatre.
Yeah, that's an extraordinary scene, as you say, where there are literally multiple Emmas appear on the stage and acting various stages of her physical withdrawal. She's literally torn into multiple versions of herself, writhing physically, mentally, enduring the hell of it. It's so evocative of her physical suffering. And also all sorts of other things in the sound and lighting design. Lighting and signs flicker, and music and sounds reach deafening levels and fall away as well. And it creates a real visceral sense of what's happening to her, and particularly even early on when she's drunk or high. There's a moment when she snorts cocaine in the reception of the rehabilitation center, and the stage direction read, "The lights in the room briefly glow brighter." And the music on the radio slows down and all other sounds cease. Then everything speeds up to catch up to reality. But there's that sense of her detachment from the world, the numbness, the spinning chaos, all of that you've managed to represent. It's fantastic.
For me, writing it felt important to, as much as possible, put the audience in Emma's experience, to put them in her mind, and to not be locked out of it in a position of judgment. The idea that she could be twitching and hallucinating, but we're just watching someone sort of on stage, and we're not part of that. We're not experiencing what she's experiencing, felt wrong. I felt it was much more sort of morally really important, particularly as I was writing primarily for people who understood this experience, to break down that position of judgment. And so we should see what she sees. It was interesting. I remember in the first time through, and we rediscovered this time around as well, when we got to tech and the previews, Denise has to sort of guide us, almost like she's pointing the camera at what we should be looking at. There's an amazing moment in Angers' projection design where tiles shatter and are sort of gravitationally moving upwards. But if that's happening behind Emma, it doesn't quite read in the same way that she needs to see it for us to see it. They're all things in her mind, not things in the concrete reality, if that makes any sense. And so one of the challenges formally in that is there can't really be any conventional scene changes. If you read the play text, there's no scene breaks, there's no separate scenes. It's one long break and then an interval and then another long break, because we remain in her experience, we remain in her subjectivity. And so when the furniture starts moving around, when she's taken into her room and a bed appears and a toilet appears and a sink, she's seeing these things appear. The rules of the play are slightly different for that character than they are for any of the others around her. And it's really fun, but ultimately it came from serving this central gesture, which is that we are experiencing what she's experiencing and not just sitting in a position of judgment over this person.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. And we do align ourselves with her in that sense, I think, because of the way we are seeing things unfold. It's her compromised vision we're seeing a lot of the time, whether she's intoxicated or in detox, and how blurred that must be if you're in that state. We only pick up details. We're not really fully aware of our surroundings in those sort of conditions, I guess. But also the lack of judgment. It's interesting how we align ourselves with her, for example, her criticisms of what's going on in the process, or her humor. And I was going to ask you about how funny this is as well, because although it absolutely does not glamorize her suffering, that's for certain, but it's also leavened by her humor. So we're with her on that perspective.
I'm so glad you mentioned this. I think often the plays I write sound like incredibly bleak evenings. And they are all, I don't know how I felt when I ultimately had to resign to the fact that I write comedies. I think when I first started out, I wanted to be Samuel Beckett or something, but that's just not my voice as a writer. It's really funny. It's really funny from the beginning, but I think even the humor is used, hopefully, to tell the story of empathizing with this character. At the beginning, we're laughing at this person and we're finding her funny. And as you say, the list of things she's consumed before showing up at rehab is horrifying, and you're really worried and scared for her, but it is hilarious. Her lack of self-awareness is inherently comic. And then by the end of it, she's cracking jokes and we're laughing with her and we're feeling for her and caring about her. But yeah, I'm glad you mentioned it. It's a fun show, and it's a funny show as well.
And some of that humor is the dark humor we resort to when we're going through something scary.
That's right, yeah.
But also, I think you grant her some certainly intelligent, if not finally persuasive arguments that she makes when she challenges some of the assumptions about what's going on in the treatment, for example. And I wondered how deliberately you wanted to explore the treatment program. For example, there's references to the 12-step program pioneered and followed by Alcoholics Anonymous, I believe. And she doesn't buy into this initially at all, partly because how much Christian faith in God is part of the original program, and that she is being asked to give over your care to God, be entirely ready for him to remove all the defects of your character, and finally to have a spiritual awakening. And I think you give her some really rational, intelligent challenges to some of these assumptions.
Yes, As you can hear by me trying to answer any of these answers, she's far more articulate, spontaneously articulate than I can be. And I wanted her to be incredibly intelligent and to use her intelligence to combat everyone around her. I mean, in a more typical play, you'd get a hero who is fighting for their survival and they're surrounded by antagonists. And in this play, she's sort of surrounded by people who want to save her life, and she's her own antagonist. But I had a really interesting experience writing this play, the near decade that I spent working on it, and the people I met and the experiences I had with those people. And I started, similar to Emma in a way, incredibly cynical about this process, which had come from very evangelical Christian roots in America. And I struggled as a sort of fairly secular person, and at that time, much more cynically so. I knew if I had to be dependent on surrendering to a belief in God, deciding to believe in something that I had no evidence for, I thought there must be another way. And so I think in the early days of thinking about wanting to write about this and talking to people who had tried to get sober or had got sober and had really struggled with that aspect themselves, I wanted to represent that. And then in the near decade, as I say, of working on this play, I saw how this process saved people's lives. And I saw how the process of going to meetings kept people alive. And I think a huge part of that is the surrendering of control. The letting go is in the Serenity Prayer, the recognition that there are some things you just can't control and you have to just accept that. And that is a higher power, that sort of relinquishing your own power over a situation to something beyond you. Then I started softening to it when I saw that it sort of worked. And beyond that, I think connection is, and again, 10 years on, there's much more research into this, but human connection is such a powerful thing. Going into the pandemic and having that removed from all of us and being isolated, I really acutely felt its absence. And I think there's an overlap with theatre at its best and how group therapy and how AA meetings and NA meetings work, which is that you show up for yourself and you show up for other people, and you can be seen and heard, and you see and hear, and you can be a community of people, and you feel less alone. And addiction is an isolating illness, depression is an isolating illness, and theatre at its best, when you show up in a community of strangers and you sit side by side with people who may have an incredibly different lived experience to you, and you're watching characters who are going through experiences that maybe you've never had like it, but you're feeling for them and you're crying with them and you're laughing with them and you care about them. I think there's an alchemy there, which is incredibly powerful. And I think at its best, this play works in that way. And again, to go back to Bunny's design, the fact that wherever you sit in this theatre, you're seeing Emma with an audience behind her. You're always seeing her in the context of that. And I've tried a number of times to write the screenplay version of this, and the contract is entirely different when you're not in the room with them, when you're not sharing that experience, when you're not hearing other people laugh and cry around you, and you're not in the room with her. It's just sort of inert. It's sort of dead on the page. So in order to make that work, I think there's going to have to be a different sort of metaphor found somehow.
Well, that's right. The setup of the theater, where there's seats on both sides of this transverse theater in the current production, and therefore you're looking at each other. We're all engaged in that way. I think it's interesting you're saying about Emma's intelligence. She's fiercely rational, questioning everything. So it's not easy for her to give up control, to submit to the guidance of others. And as we said, she rejects the religious elements that are in the program as an ameliorating answer to the meaningless she sees in life. For a start, she describes the world as purposeless chaos and actually justifies herself in some way that the only answer to such nihilism is to self-medicate, which there's a kind of, logic to. But it's also fascinating, I think, your analogy with the theater. There's so many associations in the play between the addiction, its treatment, the group therapy, and the theater, the world that Emma inhabits and that we are as an audience in, of course. Starting, for example, that she cites that her addiction is not unlike the addiction she has for performing. That adrenaline high that she gets from performing is like a drug. She says you get to live the most intense moments of a life over and over again with all the boring bits left out, including the intensity of relationships. You fall in love on stage and off, and then it's over and you don't see them again. So I think it's quite challenging to come back to a normal life in that world.
I mean, it's interesting hearing that description. The sort of softening I had to AA and the 12 steps and that kind of process is similar to the experience I had writing the play and my feeling about theatre, where when I began writing this play, I wasn't under commission. No one was putting on any of my plays. I'd spent so much time training. I'd written the best things I thought I could, and no one was interested. Meanwhile, all my peers who I had gone to the Royal Court Writers Group with or whatever were, writing movies and having series commissioned and having plays on in the West End, and nothing was happening for me. And I was also at the same time going to see plays and finding a lot of them irrelevant, uninclusive, untrue to the times we were living in. And I was losing faith in theatre as an art form, I suppose. And my cynicism for the process was similar to my cynicism about theatre. And I went through a similar experience writing it, that I sort of fell back in love with it. I softened towards theatre as well as softening towards the 12 steps and this kind of treatment, and sort of found a real love for it again and a justification for it again. And yeah, to go back to what I was saying before, I think there's a similar alchemical mechanism in both group therapy and in theatre. And I think the optimism we inevitably feel by the end of the play, I think is partly what I found myself through the process of writing it.
Wow, it's fabulous. Yes, there is a sense that we, the audience, are like the group coming together to listen to Emma's story in the recovery meeting. And we are witnesses, participants, being asked to engage our empathy in the way the members of the group do. And I mean, this is a metaphor, as you so eloquently said, for what happens when we go to the theater generally in the best occasions. But also the other elements of her being an actress. I mean, this is not just true of the acting world. The adrenaline, I mean, from anyone working in a high wire life or activity, top level sports or corporate life, any of our lives, where if we perform in a high stakes context, other aspects of everyday life can feel pretty mundane, leaving you craving more excitement. But I mean, this might just be the kind of excuse. I think I read somewhere, Jeremy, that you were slightly concerned at one stage about whether anyone would have any sympathy for an actress who's going into rehab. Isn't it all just self-indulgent of the celebrity, for example?
I think that's the exciting danger of it, that actually you make the hurdle higher. When I first read a draft of People, Places and Things, she wasn't an actress, she was a violinist.
Ah.
And there was a very expensive moment where she smashed up a Stradivarius. But, that was all exciting.
Also harder to cast.
Yeah, I mean, without a load of fakery, for sure. But Duncan just sort of absolutely met the kind of provocation, I think, that he'd given himself. And what was dangerous about it has become one of the most exciting aspects of the production, is that you have a performative reality and you have a sort of fictional reality, and the two things talk really pleasingly to each other. And that's one of my favourite things about theatre, is that you construct a fictional environment that the audience can feel safe to step into and imagine, but also something real is happening. There is a human being in the room. And, if you cough, it's going to affect them. If they say something you want to laugh, it's part of a conversation that's really happening. And I think, we've done several versions over the years where we've shared what we've been doing in a rehearsal room, just with a load of orange chairs, with people that we've invited in, particularly people who are going through recovery or have got a relationship with the material. And those have always been the most satisfying, because you really recruit the audience's imagination and they're aware that they're part of it. And it's been a really soulful experience to remember that actually theatre is human beings in space moving forward through action of one description or another. So yeah, it's a technical show and it's a complex show, but also at its heart, I think it has all the virtues of a simple piece of theatre, an act of theatre, as Peter Brook would say.
Well, it's interesting you're talking about the conflation of fiction and reality, because, of course, this is part of Emma's problem as well as an actor. Her job is playing different types of people, adopting the identity of characters. She says, if I'm not in character, I'm not sure I'm really there. And we see this through the play, don't we? Is there an authentic Emma? Is it always performative? Who is she? I guess it's one of the dangers, perhaps, of her profession, that she's being asked to be that malleable about her identity and moving between those fictional worlds and the real world.
I suppose it's one of the dangers of her profession, but I think it's one of the dangers that lie in wait for all of us. Who are we? How do we choose to define ourselves? what are we carrying with us? You know, what baggage do we take with us? What baggage of other people, previous generations, is lying in wait for us? And is addiction simply a gesture towards self-medication in the face of all of these psychic challenges? So yeah, what's great about making her an actress is that you have the kind of lexicon to talk directly about identity and how we present. But actually, and I've always said this about the play, that the structure of addiction is a way to talk about all the other things. You know, it's not just a play that has meaning for people going through those issues or whose lives have been struck by those issues. We're all dealing with who we are in the face of almost insurmountable noise and cacophony, really. We're in a hamster wheel where reality is challenged at every angle. And the fact of this woman in this space trying to achieve this objective feels, you know, when it boils down to her meeting that challenge, it feels refreshingly simple and clear.
Yeah, it's almost as if you saw my note here at the top of my page. The play is not just about addiction. It's more generally about how we invent or negotiate our own identity. And we all do that to some extent in different company and contexts, presenting various versions of ourselves. We spend our lifetime focusing on understanding, defining, developing who we are, want to be. And of course, how we define ourselves will be hugely influenced by other people, especially perhaps our parents. And I wanted to ask you both about Emma and her relationship with her mother. As the doctor says, you talk about your mother a lot. So her mother plays a big part in the psychological portrait of Emma we see, doesn't she?
I really wanted to write about mothers and daughters. I've had a few attempts in various things about that. The first version of Every Brilliant Thing was about that dynamic as well. And the Western drama canon is generally really good at fathers and sons. There's a lot of plays about secrets between fathers and sons, disappointments, you know, betrayals. Do you love me, Dad? Those sorts of plays. And they're great. I mean, there's 1,000 of them. And there's weirdly few plays about mothers and daughters. And I was increasingly spending time with female friends talking about their relationships with their moms. And they seemed incredibly overwhelming and complicated and varied. And again, it just felt like an absence in the theatre canon of really good plays about those complex relationships. And I think another thing I return to a lot in my plays is generational trauma and the debt from one generation to the next. This time round in rehearsal, we had an amazing family therapist who works in addiction who said, oh, for me, the mother is the protagonist of the play because it's her unresolved trauma that is being played out through the play through her daughter. And reframing the play in that way as a middle-aged woman in the present moment trying to resolve trauma that isn't hers necessarily, but is her mother's, is really interesting and gave us a new, is all there in the play, but I don't think we quite had the vocabulary around that.
Just remind us, there's a hint of what the mother's trauma is?
Yeah, so she lost both her parents at a young age. Emma says she was moved around a lot, and yet she triumphed in spite of everything. So she's someone who hasn't resolved that early childhood trauma and the impact it had on the rest of her life. And so writing about parents and their, not just young children and their parents, but writing about grown-ups and their parents. I think when I was younger, I thought when I got to be that age, you know, everything would be resolved and everything would be fine. But actually, you know, it never goes away and only gets more complicated as life goes on. And I wanted to depict that. We've got the amazing Sinead Cusack, and it's a very complicated role. She's playing 3 different, very distinctly different parts without wanting to mark them too sharply. She's playing 3 different roles. But it's like the word in a stick of rock. You know, the idea of the mother is there from the very beginning. And it's almost a punchline when she appears as the mother at the very end.
Yes. I was going to ask you about that, just for people who haven't seen it, that you double the actor, in this case, Sinead Cusack, plays the doctor, the therapist, and Emma's mother, ultimately. And in fact, this is sort of foreshadowed when Emma at the beginning says, you look like my mother.
Yeah.
But I guess you have some psychological reason for her being this dominant figure of authority in various contexts.
If you take the argument that the plays from Emma's point of view, then she's projecting her mother onto these female authority figures, and she's trying to impress them. She's trying to defeat them. She's trying to make them love her. She's trying to accept them. She's doing all of that. And you think it's just a ruse until the actual real mum turns up, and she's more real than you could have imagined. And actually the play swings from Emma's point of view at that point, I hope, to understanding what it's like for parents to be dealing with a family member who's had all the ups and downs of addiction and recovery. A lot of people have thanked us for that moment, for representing the experience of loving families of addicts, because it's a very complicated place to be.
That's a great scene, and we'll come to that in just a minute. But you're right about how that presents the generational trauma, because it starts from Emma's perspective that she feels that her mother has not loved her unconditionally, perhaps. She says at some point that she's not the person her parents wanted her to be, that her mother never approved of a single boyfriend or career choice. And she says, drugs and alcohol have never let me down. They have always loved me. By implication, that her mother has not loved her unconditionally, I suppose. This is pop psychology to some degree on my part, but
she also says, she never approved of a single boyfriend or decision that I made, but she never said anything about it. It's a really even portrayal.
It is. It's a hard position for the child to live with as a grown-up child, because we all want to forge our own way, but also very difficult to escape caring about the expectations, opinion of our parents. And I guess some way she's imposing expectations on her daughter, coming from how she's survived. She's impatient that her daughter isn't as successful in surviving as she apparently has been, although, again, you're saying she may be suppressing things there.
I suppose I'm reluctant a little bit to, as you say, psychoanalyze too much, partly because by the end you sort of realize you can't trust anything Emma says. And you sort of leave that scene not really knowing anything for certain about Emma. And also, I mean, despite what I said about the protagonist being Emma's mother's trauma, I think it's easy to oversimplify reasons for addiction and to diagnose it too cleanly. And if anything, the play is showing how complicated it is. And so there's not one clean reason for her addiction, but hopefully that final scene is, as Jeremy says, our sympathies for each character shift and grow and get more complicated. And it's more of a sort of chess game between them. And it's not just, as the mother says, I will not be made the villain in this. I hope she's not. And the blame is not laid purely at her feet.
No, I agree. It's clearly not as simple as that. But it is an extraordinary scene, this scene where she comes home having graduated the program from the clinic, and she wants to apologize, make amends, perhaps find some shelter and support with her parents. But they've been through all sorts with her previously. And as you say, Jeremy, they have suffered so much that they are almost spent in terms of their sympathy and their trust, how to believe anything, because she has lied and lied and lied. It's so beautifully set up, Duncan, because we see a rehearsed version of this scene previously. So what happens in the clinic is that they practice conversations they're going to have with important others in their lives when they come out. And so we've already seen her practice this scene. And it's an expectation that the parents are going to go, oh dear, finally you've come to see the trouble of your ways, and we will support you whatever you need, and all that kind of happy fictional ending of sorts. And it just does not go that way at all, because their tolerances have been almost exhausted. And they say some shockingly cruel things in the context. The audience must be aghast because you've inverted the usual cliche of this scene.
I suppose that, again, it's a bit of misdirect in that sense. In the practiced version in the rehab center, we're given a potential ending of this sort of almost ideal version of what that reconciliation moment would look like. And so our expectations are that it could be like that. But again, they do say some shocking things, but I wanted, as well as to let people with addiction and people in recovery feel recognized and seen and represented authentically, I wanted people who are the loved ones and the family members of addicts to also feel seen and represented. And I think the things they say, it's not me as the author sort of in a position of judgment over them. It's actually me giving them a voice. This is how it feels sometimes. For all we know, they've had this conversation. They've been sat down in the bedroom 100 times, 300 times by their daughter saying, this time it's going to be different. And we cannot imagine the amount they've been lied to and the amount they've been disappointed and had things stolen from them. And as they say, living with the thought that any minute now the police are going to be on the door. And this is a family in grief as well. And so it's a way of giving them a voice rather than putting them in a position of judgment. But it's also, to go back to what we were saying at the very beginning, the two possible endings we've set up, that she's either going to be fixed definitively or she's going to be dead on her bedroom floor. They're the things we're told all the way through are what's going to happen. she's gone there thinking, well, if I can be with my mum, spoilers alert, please book a ticket before 10th of August when we finish and then come back to this. But she thinks if she can just sit there with her mum and be in the most dangerous place she can be, the people, places, and things, these are the things that could potentially trigger relapse. And this is the most dangerous place she feels she can be. And she feels like she still wants that definitive fix. And so she feels like if she can survive being in a room with her mum, she'll be fine. And then it goes so much worse than she thinks it's going to. And then the box full of drugs and alcohol collected from her flat at the very beginning in the play is presented to her, and then she's left alone. And for me, I suppose good drama, when it comes down to it, the only thing we really care about in a play is live decision making. We want to see a character wrestling with a choice. And there's a time pressure, and there's a personal pressure, and there's environmental pressure, and there's clear stakes to that choice. But we're just seeing a moment of decision making. And for me, there doesn't need to be any dialogue in that moment. It's just the question of the whole play is, will she use or not? Will she use again? And here we have it. We have a woman standing in a room with a box full of substances, and she's looking at the box and she doesn't know the answer to that question, and she is incredibly repelled from it, and she's incredibly compelled towards it. And for a moment we are just holding our breath, hopefully, in that theatre, hoping she's going to make the right choice. But going back to what Jeremy was saying about involving people in the community and bringing them into our rehearsal room, our final preview, when we first did this at the Dorfman in the National, we got to this scene and Emma is in this moment of decision looking at this drug box. And then she gets a phone out of her bag and calls a number and says, "Hi, I was given this number. I was wondering if there might be a meeting I could go to tonight." And someone in the audience yelled out, "Good girl." And Denise looked over and caught eyes with one of the people we'd met who was starting their recovery journey as we were beginning our rehearsals. And we went into a rehabilitation centre in Catford, which is a wonderful, wonderful centre. And we'd had this kind of quite profound experience with these people. And unbeknownst to us, he'd completed his treatment. He was there with his family and some other people that we'd met from the recovery centre. And they bought tickets and they were sitting there on our final preview. And we sort of felt afterwards, that's who we made it for. And we've been really worried about press night coming up. And we just got our 5-star review. We're now bulletproof because the people we made it for were connected with this character, cared about this character, had gone on that journey and were engaged and wanted her to do the right thing. And so we went into that first press night, reminding ourselves what we were doing and why we were doing it.
As Jeremy said earlier, this is the reason you want to keep putting it out there. It's not just for the press and the money or the reviews or whatever. It's the message reaching the people.
Yeah.
I think the balance in the presentation of the parents is fantastic because while they are, it seems cruel, we do understand it's coming from a place of such deep pain and disappointment and suffering that they've been through. And there's a fantastic line, which I think conveys that paradox when, as you mentioned, we haven't talked about, but one of the elements in the play is that she has had a brother who's died. And the father at one point shockingly says to her, "It should have been you that we buried. At least we'd know you were out of trouble." I mean, in that line is the paradox because they still obviously love her completely. And it's just torture for them that she's doing this to herself.
Yeah. And then he says, "I love you too. And I'll get us a takeout later." You know, it's a complicated relationship.
But also she said, hasn't she? She said it should have been me.
She's offered that, yeah. It should have been me who died.
And he said, "You're right, it should have been you. At least we'd have known you'd been out of trouble." I was interested this time round. That line gets a reaction now in a way that it didn't before.
And what sort of reaction?
That was my impersonation of the reaction. A gasp.
It's one of the great joys of our lives is making, you know, a whole room full of people gasp in a theatre. It's the most satisfying thing you can do.
Yeah, that's one where it's really shocking. And then the one where the mum says, you know, drinking and taking drugs were the only thing that made you any fun.
The biggest reaction is one I would love not to spoil, but it's in that scene. It's another thing that the mum says, and it gets the best reaction. You'll have to go and see it to see it.
Oh, that's terrible. Okay, you left us hanging, so that is a very good reason. And I love the fact for all the blistering frankness of their exchanges, it's beautifully counterpointed by, as you described, the ordinariness with which they fall back into their established, inescapable family routines. Mom and Dad continuing with the plan to order Chinese takeaway for dinner for them all. For all the fireworks, this life will go on. They will go on somehow.
That's right. And living in recovery is oftentimes having these difficult situations and difficult conversations and negotiating them and being offered drugs and alcohol and having to refuse it. And this is her life going forward. So it's, to go back to my imperfect metaphor of the coin landing on its edge, this is the edge I'm trying to land on. Is there is no definitive endpoint. It's going to be a number of situations to a lesser or greater extent like this, where she's going to be trapped in this moment of decision making. And it's up to us, I suppose, whether we feel like she's going to be successful at that.
Yes, the final scene, again, there may be a risk of spoilers. As you say, she has the box of drugs and alcohol in front of her, and the question is she going to succumb or not? But the scene transitions to her in an audition in an empty space in a spotlight. And she's giving this speech, which, as she told us previously in the play, she had done as a corporate job when she was a young actress, which is full of sort of platitudinous, positive, inspiring stuff. In a world that says you shouldn't try, that you will fail, in a world that says no, say yes. Some of these lines are inspirational. We stand resolutely in the present, arms wide, looking towards the future. I am now, you are now, we are now. This is the beginning. I mean, you can be critical of it and saying it's just cliche and sentimental.
That's right.
But she uses this as her audition piece, and she uses it as a mantra to herself as well, of sorts. And so she gives this inspiring speech and she commits to it. That's the important bit as an actress. She does this with true passion and belief. And then a voiceover says, thanks very much, just like another audition. Has she got the part? Who knows? There'll be more of these auditions to come. Where does this leave us? What do we think her future is?
Well, she's sort of, the worst thing that could have happened in terms of her interaction with her parents has happened. And she's back to square one. But at the same time, I find her quite awe-inspiring, actually, by the end. I find the fact that she is soldiering on and pushing forwards despite everything. And she's back to doing the very first thing. She's back to, literally back to square one. And as you say, this slightly meaningless piece of corporate advertising, in the context of the fact that she shared it with her brother, the fact that she's now shared it with Mark, who's become a great friend to her, and everything she's been through, she imbues it with so much meaning by the end. As you said, the context of it gives her meaning. And oh my God, we haven't really talked enough about Denise Gough coming along and doing this role, but you can give her a fairly meaningless speech and she can sell the hell out of it, and she can make it inspiring and heartbreaking. And the version which Jeremy mentioned about her being a classical musician, this very early draft, it was going to end with, a virtuosic violin solo. And this is the equivalent of that, where just to show how good an actress this person is, we give her a not particularly brilliant speech and she can make us weep and get on our feet.
Interestingly, I slightly differ from you.
What, her performance?
Well, I don't think it's that good. Yeah, I mean, the speech is full of those platitudes, and I think she doesn't sell the shit out of it. She's in the center of herself saying this stuff, and the guy on the other end of the microphone, the director character,
isn't wowed. Yeah, we don't feel like this is her big break and now she's going to wow everyone. And
I think that's what's so great. I mean, I think, if we needed selling on Denise's abilities as an actress, then, you get it within the first 5 minutes and then you stay there. What gives me optimism is the fact that she's in some sort of form of acceptance about herself. She's on that journey of understanding herself, understanding her place in that industry. And she says very modestly, thank you for seeing me. And off she goes.
That's it, which is the key of the play, really.
There is another version, which is a virtuosic, unstorming thing, but you've tied your hands behind your back as a writer there by writing so accurately a kind of corporate speak. And she does fill it up, and she is brilliant. But we're left on the edge of the coin, as you so brightly said.
I think we have little doubt that she's not got this part. And the important thing is that she's shown up.
That's it.
And more than that she's able to accept that she might not get this part. And there's going to be more of these that she's going to show up to, because this is one of the people, places, and things that she's got to confront and overcome. Yeah. And she's going to keep doing that.
That's completely right. But it feels heroic to me in the sense that she says to the doctor in their last conversation, if I ever go to another audition again, it'll be like climbing Everest.
Yeah.
And then we see her climbing Everest.
Yeah.
Her version of that. And so it does feel heroic. But also it repositions us, I think, in that moment, particularly then you see the other actresses queuing up for this part. And I mean, particularly people like Jeremy and I in this industry who have auditions all the time, that each one of these people is a real human being who has a whole life story that we cannot know about and are showing us the tip of the iceberg, but there's a whole iceberg underneath. And that is true of every single human being. And hopefully that will make us in some way, even subconsciously, feel differently about everyone we're sitting in the audience with. And when we walk out and we see someone sleeping in a shop doorway, we will hopefully see them a bit more like a human being. To go back to what I was talking about in terms of human connection and empathy is really the answer. Mark says, not to be too John Lennon about it all, but that's what it's about, love. It's a naff thing to say, but I think it's true. And I think that is the thing that keeps people sober in some way. Connection, love, community, not being alone, being seen.
I think he also says, doesn't he, the hardest thing is to love yourself, which is partly what Emma's problem has been, in which maybe she's just beginning to accept herself some way.
Very much so. I mean, that's everybody's life's work, isn't it?
That's a great thought about the empathy that we see for all the other actresses lined up there as well. Thank you both. That's a fantastic spot to draw to a conclusion. Before I let you both go, Jeremy will remember that one of the features of the podcast is I like to ask my guests to recommend another play that we might do on the podcast, or one that you just personally love. And last time, you recommended People, Places, and Things. A good call.
So I better be careful what I recommend this time in case you bring me back in.
It may be your next project, but I'm certainly going to rope you in. Jeremy, what would you recommend?
Well, I'm just quickly looking at the texts on my shelves because I'd forgotten about this bit. But actually, the first one that pings out to me, and it is a very good call, is Dürrenmatt's The Visit, which is a fantastically brilliant play. And I was lucky enough to do a production of it at the National Theatre that didn't quite hit the target that we wanted to, but I'm immensely proud of it. I think it was fantastic. The great Leslie Manville played Claire Zakanassian, who is the world's richest woman. She returns to her hometown for mysterious reasons. We realize that she's there on a mission of revenge. And it's a play, if such a thing is possible, that seems to hold within it all the malevolence of 20th century capitalism in a thrilling plot. And it's really fun. And it's a play that I love deeply. There's a version by Tony Kushner that has fantastic, fantastic moments. And I'd recommend it.
Sounds like it's something we should keep doing. And as you recommended it and you love it, I may come back to you when we do it. Thank you, Jeremy. How about you, Duncan?
Well, after this conversation, I'm sure Johnny Donahoe and I should come back and talk about Every Brilliant Thing as well.
I missed my opportunity to set that one up. We should have confirmed.
Well, you're on. I saw this in 2014 in Edinburgh.
Oh, you did?
And some of the audience participation I was not so keen on. I was sitting up in the back row deliberately, but absolutely loved it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the 10-year anniversary of the first time we took it to Edinburgh. So we're taking it back again this time and rethinking it in lots of ways. And it's nice to revisit it. But I also suggest, I've seen Jeremy O. Harris's Slave Play is coming up, and it's invigorated and pissed off a lot of people before it's even opened. And it's a play that will, I'm sure, inspire a very interesting conversation. So I'd suggest you cover that.
Yes, I am seeing that.
Jeremy, if you can get him on, he's a really interesting guy. And unlike me, is incredibly verbally articulate and opinionated and clear and provocative and funny, and it would be a really good guest. So yeah, I suggest him.
You do yourself a disservice. You're a really good guest.
Oh, thanks.
And keep writing plays as well, however long it takes. People, Places, and Things continues at the Trafalgar Theatre in London until the 10th of August. What more can we say? Don't miss it. As the curtain falls on Emma's audition, just one of many we expect will follow in the hard, ordinary days ahead. How do we feel about her chances of not relapsing, of making a stable life for herself? It's impossible to know for sure. What we have seen is that it is far from easy. We are constantly assaulted with people, places, and things that challenge our sense of self-worth. And for anyone who has been trapped by addiction to seek false comforts or solutions, we can't but feel a huge empathy for the suffering it brings, because there, but for the grace of some unknown God, we try to stand resolutely in the present, arms wide, looking towards the future. Thanks for listening. See you next time. There are additional footnotes about this and every other play that we cover in the podcast available to our patrons. Patrons also enjoy early access to our sister podcast, The Play Review, in which Jody Rylett and I share our views on current productions on the London stage. To become a patron, please visit our website at theplaypodcast.com. And don't forget to follow us wherever you listen to podcasts so as not to miss an episode. Thank you again for listening. See you next time.